Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Talent by Design, Recruiting and Retaining the Next Generation of Procurement Leaders. I'm your host, Julia McElroy. Thank you for spending time with us today. The National Association of State Procurement Officials is a nonprofit association dedicated to advancing public procurement through leadership, excellence, and integrity. Here on the Research and Innovation team, we work to improve the profession by sharing expertise, fostering learning, and promoting innovation best practices in public procurement through webinars like these. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to explain the format of today's webinar. All attendees are muted. You can enter comments and questions in the chat box. If you'd like to ask our presenters a question, you can type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your window. Questions may be addressed during the presentation or during a Q&A session after the presentation. At the close of today's webinar, you'll be asked to complete a very brief questionnaire. Today's presentation is good for 1 contact hour. To receive your certificate, simply complete the questionnaire following the presentation. And your feedback is valuable to us at NASPO, and we appreciate your responses. With that, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. We're honored to have with us Byron Decoteau from the great state of Louisiana and George McNeely from the beautiful state of Arizona. Byron is the director of the Louisiana Department of State Civil Service, the Central Human Resources Office for Louisiana's classified state workforce. George is the Chief Human Resources Officer for the Shared Services Unit at the Arizona Department of Administration. NASPO is excited to have Byron and George with us today. George, let's begin with you. From an HR perspective, what makes public procurement a unique workforce challenge compared to other government roles?
Thank you, Julia. That's a great question. If you consider public procurement compared to other government roles, one thing I think of right away is the unique culture of procurement professionals, both in the private and public sector. And having from an HR perspective, is the ability to understand that uniqueness and when we're out there looking to develop that pipeline. And what I mean by that, when we look at a public procurement professional, much of their I will call it value or what they bring to the table is their network of suppliers, their industry specific knowledge, their previous experience working through contracts and financial environments, contract negotiations, that type of thing. And I think where the unique workforce challenge is bridging the gap with the HR professional to make sure that they understand those unique needs of the procurement units and the professionals. I think I can draw a comparison to if you look at when you're recruiting for veterans out of the military, there's a unique needs, unique lingo. And there are plenty of resources out there that help you make that transition and help recruiters, HR staff understand the specific needs of those professionals as they enter the workforce. And I think that's what makes procurement a unique challenge when HR is trying to fill those roles.
That's great, George. And I know that you were a former Marine, or I guess once you're a Marine, you're always a Marine, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So you probably understand the unique challenges and opportunities that our veterans provide to the workforce.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we see that with, I think, procurement professionals. And in my experience, it's a very fast moving cycle for the workforce to get to those talented individuals to secure them for your organization. We see a high demand for it. We see competitive wages, but they have very similar challenges with other units in public service. But I think that crossover with a network of suppliers and vendors is what it really makes them unique compared to some of the other professions in public service.
That's a great point. Thank you. So Byron, when recruiting for procurement positions, what skills or competencies are most important for long-term success, especially for candidates who may not come from a traditional procurement background?
Yes, thanks, Julia. I think that's a great question and timely considering the space that HR is currently operating in when you mention skills and competencies, and especially someone who may not have a procurement background, all of industry right now is really focusing on competencies and skills based to expand their applicant pools. So we traditionally have those who have a traditional educational route, and then looking for people who may have an alternative route, maybe military experience, a trade school training, on the job experience. And then you have those who may not have procurement experience at all, but may have some competencies that relate to the job. So some key competencies that I believe every job that you have in an organization, you should identify some key competencies that you're looking for in every incumbent that you're going to place into that position. When you're looking at procurement for long-term success, I believe that there are three particular areas, and I think it's the critical thinking and the judgment. You're not always going to have a black and white environment in procurement where you have very structured rules. You're going to have some gray areas. So you need an individual that's going to be able to consider different options, weigh the risk, and then also be able to make a decision and stand by that decision and articulate it. So you're really looking for someone with a competency that can have a tendency to problem solve, not just someone who can follow a checklist. Secondly, I think it's something that George just said. It is the network and the influence. So communication and influence. Procurement individuals are going to interact with multiple stakeholders. They're going to be interacting with your leadership, your project managers, your vendors, legal teams, and so forth. So they need to have that ability or that competency to build trust, because they're going to have to manage those expectations through those projects. And again, the decision making with that as well. And then finally, I think you really need to look for someone that not only you don't focus so much on someone who knows procurement well, but someone who can learn quickly and adapt quickly. So that adaptive learning, or that agility in being able to adopt a process and change and pivot when you need to. I think you can teach systems, you can teach procurement rules. It's a little more difficult to teach someone to be able to learn very quickly, and then when rules change, apply that to the system as a whole. There are other competencies outside of that, but I do think those are the ones that are going to go towards the long-term success. Some other competencies I think that you're going to need is, ethical judgment, accountability, attention to detail, thinking of the bigger picture. You want someone who has a systems thinking approach, not just looking at the transaction. How is this transaction going to affect the overall process, the deadlines, the budget, the compliance? So at its root, I think you need to make sure that you identify some core competencies. And I think that is an exercise that needs to be done with your team. So if you have a team, pull them together, look at the job descriptions, identify, talk out loud with each other, talk about those competencies that you need. So when you go to recruit for those individuals, you already have those competencies ahead of time.
No, that's a great point. And you just described the perfect procurement person. Right?
Yes.
Critical thinking skills, and you have to be a people person. The founder of Southwest Airlines would say he would hire for attitude, and then he could teach aptitude. He could teach all the systems. So that's a really good point. So George, many agencies struggle to find qualified procurement professionals. What strategies can HR leaders use to expand the talent pipeline and attract candidates who may not have previously considered this career path?
Okay, thank you very much. So I just wanted to real quickly build on what Byron was talking about with maybe a tool that the state of Arizona uses to help identify those attributes that he was talking about, the decision making, the agility. I love that word, agility, right? We use a tool called Predictive Index, but it's like many other personality profile systems. It allows us to hiring managers to build job models, right? and these job models will help capture those characteristics of that perfect procurement professional that you're looking for. And it will compare their applications, their personality profile to that job model to see what kind of fit they are with that role, right? It gives you maybe 3 or 4 different profiles that would match closely to the skill sets that you're looking for in that role. And it's used as a guide. It's not perfect, but it's a starting point, right? And where we see quite a bit of that value built is when those hiring managers and that recruiter get together and they build that job model, because it requires some collaboration and discussion about what are we really looking for, right? So it's, a lot of it's pulled from the PD, but also those characteristics that you want in a procurement professional, ethical decision making, speed, initiative, those type of things. So using a tool helps bridge that gap, right, and helps get maybe narrow down that candidate pool. As far as expanding the talent pipeline, I think the quick answer is to look for non-traditional routes, right? And when I think about that, clearly we're going to go to industry organizations. We're going to engage maybe workforce development at the state level, even look to the universities. But I would encourage you here at Arizona. In Arizona, we're fortunate to have large junior college networks that are building on that skill set. Look towards them. Look to colleges specific. At ASU, we have Arizona State University. Has a supply chain management school. Right. Touch base with them and get the word out. Back to what Brian was saying, skills-based talent management is something that the state of Arizona is very much focused on at this point. When we look at not so much focusing on maybe the degree or certifications, 92% of our jobs at the state of Arizona don't have a degree requirement, right? We're shifting our focus to those skills and experience. I think somewhere we could improve is expanded internship opportunities. I think there's a lot of interested candidates out there who just don't know how fun it can be in procurement, right? Or maybe that is, they can dip their toe into it, try it out, and then maybe we get a good candidate from that, and someone, a true believer in that industry. I go back to the military always. There's a program called SkillBridge, right? I don't know if you've heard of it, but SkillBridge is a program funded by the DoD where it allows a transitioning service member to work for your organization on up to about 6 months on an internship paid by the DoD. Basically they get permission for the last 6 months of their enlistment, and they're allowed to go work at your organization, basically as an intern. And, the expectation is hopefully it develops into a job. So as soon as they transition out of the military, they can go to work for you, but it's not required. Fortunately, at the state, we have an umbrella MOU with the DoD that covers all our 100 state agencies, and we're trying to engage in that. It's not a large volume program, but it is definitely a successful one, right? To try and give someone an opportunity to try and work with your organization and see if they're a right fit for you, and vice versa. And then, expanding your talent pipeline also means considering things like remote work and adjusted work schedules. I think we could probably apply that to almost any conversation that we have about workforce development. There's different expectations out there nowadays, and there's a lot of choice, right? So how do we be competitive as a public institution with some of those things that are being offered out there in the private sector as well?
George, just to return to 2 points. Do you know, what was the name of the program, the DoD program you'd mentioned?
Sure, it's called SkillBridge.
SkillBridge. Okay, great. Yep. So we'll put that information out to our members. That sounds like an outstanding program.
It is. And I'm sorry, you don't have to reinvent the wheel too. It's a good program. There's states like state of Nevada. I don't know if we have any state of Nevada attendees. They're doing an incredible job there. They have a high volume success rate with SkillBridge. And then there's other cities out there that are doing really good work with that as well. So state of Arizona, we've been lucky. We hired about 6 SkillBridge interns last year, and we're working on doubling that this year. Yeah.
That's great. And then you had mentioned that 92% of the Arizona workforce doesn't have a degree requirement. attached to that position. Is that feels like it's high, but I don't have a baseline to know as compared to other states. Do you know?
I don't know compared to other states. I know that our class and comp group took a serious look at our position descriptions and what did it look like? And I know there was a sizable increase. I'd love to get that number though, now that you called me on it. But it's a great talking point, right? So thank you.
No, that's great. Byron, do you happen to know your state's percentage? Putting you on the spot there, but
not off the top of my head, the percentage with degrees or the jobs that require degrees?
yeah, that either don't require or do require.
Yeah. You put me on the spot and I'm drawing a blank here, but no, recently in 2024, we were already working on getting rid of degree requirements. And when I say getting rid of degree requirements, some people often, are a little shocked by that, that like we're not valuing the degree that an individual has received. And that's not the case. We're simply trying to expand our applicant pool. So we went through all of our job classifications, and we even had legislation stated that the minimum qualifications would be a degree or either 3 years of relevant experience. The only way a degree only could be required is if it was required by law. So we've eliminated a lot of those barriers in Louisiana.
That's great. I mean, that's a way to expand the pool. And I believe all three of us have our master's degrees, and so we value education. I worked in higher ed for many years, so again, value education. But at the same time, it's an acknowledgement of a degree or experience.
Right.
Which is great. So Byron, let's talk about recruiting the next generation for a moment. So what approaches are most effective in reaching early career professionals and students who might be interested in public service but are unfamiliar with the procurement as a profession?
Yeah, I think that I don't know that early career individuals are choosing other jobs rather than choosing procurement. It's kind of like George said, I don't think that many people know that it's a career opportunity. So the earlier you can get that exposure, talk to your human resources offices and find out, do they do regular recruitment fairs? Do they visit high schools? If they do, if they're going to high schools, if they're going to trade schools and colleges, ask, can I come with you? Can I send a representative from our office to, talk about what we do? Take the opportunity to see if there's an opportunity to have a student worker from a high school. Many high schools have programs where they'll have a cooperative agreement with you where the student will go to school in the morning and then work in the afternoon. That's a little bit of exposure. Then I think internships and apprenticeships are really good where you can give them a little more more complex job duties and work to get them interested in that. But I think the main thing that you can do to help you attract those people is really try to, especially in public service, put the impact on the mission and the value of what procurement does, right? You don't want to lead with just the technical stuff when you're talking to someone or when you're putting it in a job announcement. And just right after lunch, I went on and I looked at our job specs that serve, as examples of work for position descriptions. And a lot of times our HR offices will get in the habit of just copying and pasting. So I'm looking at mine right now, and it's, some examples of work is learns to apply the procurement code in order to procure goods and services, coordinates proper solicitation and evaluations of bids. Let's reframe that, as procurement professionals, let's lose that technical language and talk about solving complex problems, managing major projects, and how, the state's public dollars are serving communities. So I know this sounds really cheesy, but you can put in a job posting and you can start off your job posting with something very generic or that if you believe public dollars should work smarter, projects should move faster, and communities deserve results that you can see, This is your opportunity to make it happen. In this role, you'll solve complex problems by guiding projects. You'll manage critical project steps through from start to finish. Put the impact in there for them to see, because that is what we're finding applicants now are really looking for, is that impact, that meaningful work, and to connect to the mission. And then, I think as far as the communication with early applicants, career applicants, they really expect communication. They don't want to apply and just be sitting there waiting. I mean, they want to see in a couple of days that their, application has been reviewed, that they're being considered, and then following up and, oh, you weren't selected, but we're going to keep you in mind. Keep that communication open, keep that communication flowing to let them know that there may be other interests. So meet them where they are. So if they're in high school, if they're in college, meet them there. If they're at career fairs, go meet them there and really frame the impact of the value that you do. Let's not, and again, that's working with your HR offices. And that's what I tell our hiring managers all the time. HR is often busy, depending upon the agency. And yes, they may want to hurry up and rush and get a job posting out there. So they're going to copy and paste those generic type duties. If you can put something, a description of what it impacts, or if this particular role has something that's far beyond what the job specs say, highlight those things. Let them know what they are getting into and what they're going to get out of it.
That is such an excellent point. I love how you said, what is the impact of this position? By the way, you're hired because I love your description. You made purchasing and procurement sound exciting, which it is. So true story here. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned, I worked at a university for many, many years as their chief procurement officer. And we were having an event at the president's house, for all staff. Anyhow, I was speaking to the president's wife. And I said, the president has the best job at the university, but I actually have the second best job. And she said, oh, really? Why is that? And I said, because I'm a professional shopper. And she laughed and laughed. And I said, I mean, in a way, that is true. I get to help all the faculty and staff across campus procure what they need to do their jobs. And whether that's a great piece of scientific equipment or a combine that's working out in the wheat fields. And she just laughed and laughed, thought it was great. But I felt that was very true. Probably the best job, but I don't want to take anything away from the president.
Yeah, I was just in a meeting today with agency heads, and one of the agenda items was about a procurement bid. And, I was like, okay, well, what's this going to be about? But it was so exciting to hear what they were procuring. It was, GPS trackers for equipment, especially here in Louisiana, ATVs and boats and so forth. So you can know where they're at when there's an emergency. You don't have to go calling around. And just the way that they presented it made it exciting to hear about the work that they're doing. Mm-hmm.
It is an exciting work, but I've been in for many years and think it's, it's pretty wonderful. So, George, from a talent management perspective, what are the most effective ways agencies can retain procurement professionals and keep them engaged over the long term? Hey, George, you're on mute. Sorry. There we go.
I apologize about that. I was just saying that that's a huge topic, and it's kind of a passion of mine, the retention and engagement. We really can't impact our numbers unless we can keep people, right? If we're losing more of the talent, it makes it very difficult to maintain operations. And I think one of the key ways that we do that is through connection between the supervisor and the employee, all the way up the ladder, if you will. In the state of Arizona, we utilize a methodology called one-on-one coaching, right? And some of you may be familiar with something like that, but it is really can be an informal or formal way of having scheduled meetings between the supervisor and the employee to communicate, to build that bond, build trust, establish goals, quick course correction, align work goals for the unit and for personal and professional goals there. and also, but the core of it is to develop problem solving skills, right? So I think just that engagement alone is a great starting point. So that gets the communication flowing between the supervisor and the employee, and that extends beyond procurement professionals, right? But it's applicable to the entire organization. But I think with procurement professionals, I think it's important that, much like maybe with HR, you get so busy and your one-on-one that's intended to be a conversation about the employee ends up becoming a business meeting. You just can't. You have to take time to work on that supervisor employee relationship, right? So I think that's a key thing to start with. Another thing for retention is understanding your workforce. Are you doing engagement surveys, stay surveys? Why are people staying at your organization? You know, at the state, we do some 30-day, 120, 360, I think it is, that we try and understand why people are staying or why are they leaving with those exit surveys. Those are very important to understand what they're saying and why they're staying. I will tell you one thing that we find when along the retention lines is across demographics, across job families, people leave because public sector is not competitive on their compensation, but just as much they have issues with their leadership, right? So that kind of leads into how do we retain? We work on our leadership roles as well, right? Leadership development. That is as much about keeping your people as compensation is in the long run. Along with compensation, you know, look at your comp strategies. You know, 2 years ago, the state of Arizona looked at our comp guidelines. We took a look at how can we be more competitive through creativity, giving the agencies more options to recognize performance through merit incentives, spot incentives. We do meritorious leave. Different agencies have different budgets, right? Some don't have any play in it. Some have a little bit more. How can we help retain those critical positions? Do we do critical retention incentives? You know, those type of things to help keep those procurement professionals in the organizations that we need them in, right? For continuity of operations, back to that. Then also hiring incentives, you know, as part of our comp strategies. You know, when we're bringing someone in, if we want to be competitive, what else can we offer? Because typically they'll come back with a counter offer, right? So how do we manage that process is a big thing. Overall, though, kind of circles back to the one-on-one coaching for retention and engagement, I think, is succession planning. People need to understand where they're going in their career with this organization, right? And how do we lay it out? And do we have those conversations? Are we doing knowledge transfer? Or are we hoarding all the information on how to get things done to ourselves? It's important that we share. We make our team stronger. We elevate the entire team, right? People want to trust that there's a path for growth. And if there's not, they want to have that honest conversation and understand, well, what can I do to add value so that I can grow, right? So there's you know, like I said, this is a huge topic, but the connection, the planning, obviously the compensation, and then managing your data with good work, managing your workforce with good data, understanding what's really happening. I think I hit on a lot of things there, but I think really the connection makes a difference, honestly. And we see that in the scores. The culture of an agency will dictate the retention, the ability to keep those people there. And we see that compared, you know, our engagement surveys compare different agencies, and we can tell by our scores where we need to focus and work on, right? And so I think it's important to dive into that and see how you can impact the workforce that way.
So a quick question for both of you. When you have someone that is a state employee, we all have limited budgets within our states, right? But George, you had mentioned that some agencies have a little more money than others. So how common is it to see state employees go from one agency to another? So you're a procurement person in DOT, but you can go over to DHS and maybe make 20% more. How common or not is that?
It is very common at the state of Arizona. It's something that we fight specifically in procurement. Some of the larger agencies that are buying quite a bit of stuff are able to draw the procurement professionals away. It's a growth opportunity, compensation opportunity. You want the best, but how do we retain? How do we compete? You have to leverage the other things like culture, um, work schedules, those type of things. If you don't have the budget.
And
Yeah,
Byron?
it's definitely a problem, not just with procurement. Every job, it's a little bit easier with procurement because in the state of Louisiana for the executive branch, it's centralized. But before it was centralized, we, of course, had the problem where you have the haves and the have-nots. Agencies with very large budgets, federal funding can offer higher salaries and address recruitment problems very easily where someone with a small budget couldn't. So absolutely, we would see people poaching employees to go to another agency. So centralization has helped a bit. But one of the things that we have been really focused on the last 2, almost 3 years is making sure that as we move forward with these special type pay mechanisms, I'm an independent agency here in Louisiana, so I work for a commission, but the commission and the governor sets wages and hours, the parameters around that. So we're very intentional about working with the governor's office to make sure that if we're going to do something, can we do that statewide and can we get the funding for it to stop that poaching? So hopefully, we're making strides there, but as long as we can't control the budget and those with the money can, wave a shiny flag at the employee to come on over to cross the street.
And I'm sure it's challenging in that it's all really the same family, right? Public
Mhm.
agencies within the same state, but they're poaching each other's employees, and we're all a little competitive.
Yes.
So I'm sure that that's a huge challenge. So we have a couple of questions in the Q&A box. Let me read these. Either one of you, please answer. So what strategies can public agencies use to attract new talent into procurement roles, especially candidates who may not be familiar with the profession? You touched on this a little bit, but fellas?
Certainly, I mean, in Louisiana, some strategies that we have, especially if you're having a difficult time recruiting, we have very defined pay plans and minimums and maximums. We can work with the agencies, and again, we've been trying to do this statewide to get a special entrance rate when someone is hired. If we want to retain someone, we can have a policy that if you're here for a year, we can bump up your pay at that year mark, get those people get those people interested in the particular job, the role. So those are some of the things as far as compensation that we have. Right now we do struggle a little bit. We do not allow telework, and that is a opportunity that people are getting in private industry. So we're having to rely on that culture and the benefits and the mission and the impact that you have.
And George, in your state, do you have telework? And if so, do you have to be a resident of Arizona, or can you be a resident out of Arizona?
Sure. So we do offer telework. Roughly 50% of our workforce works at least one day remotely. And so that's about 16,000 employees at least are working at least one day remotely. And we have employees, I believe, in about 25 to 30 different states. Not a massive number, but we do have some. There's a process to request approval to do so. More tightly controlled is there any out of country work, and we're working on that one, right? These are the challenges, like as Byron is saying, it's an incredible disadvantage if you can't offer some of these flexible work options, right? Fortunately, my HR team, for example, is about 100% remote, and it's been valuable to retention for my team to be able to do that. And we are also offered staggered 410 schedules, right? So we're able to, because we would get poached as a central office unit. We train people up and then they go to an agency for a promotion. That's great. But, a step up, more pay, more responsibility. The way we were able to compete was maybe with an adjusted schedule. one thing that we do that doesn't happen often, but it is another option, is we have what's called a talent mobility program. Unfortunately, we've had some agencies who have lost grant funding, and that's resulted in a staff reduction. Right. Prime example: I had an agency in December have to do a staff reduction of about 40 individuals, mainly in the educational field. But they have some great skill sets, some PIOs, public information officers, some grant writers, those type of things. So we actively, this program, Talent Mobility, we try and keep them in the state system, keep their retirement, keep them from a break in service. So we aggressively flag their applications in our job board and promote the availability of these skill sets to the other agencies. So I will meet with a CHRO, say from Department of Economic Security, and say, this group is looking for work. Please, here's the list of the job titles. We have a recruiter who's dedicated to be able to kind of connect you with those. So taking that core skill set, like I think Byron said at the beginning of our conversation today, they don't necessarily have to have the specific procurement skills, because we can teach that. But it's about commitment to those employees and retaining them in the state system.
That sounds like a fantastic idea, because in the end, you're benefiting folks too who will benefit from a state pension at some point when they're ready to retire. So keeping them within the system is wonderful. So great.
Yeah, it actually, we received incredible feedback. Last year, we had a much higher number of staff reductions, unfortunately. And the amount of response that I received that, hey, it shows the state cares. We're not just turning you out on the street, essentially. We're trying to find you a role. We were able to place about 27% of the group that we had to do a staff reduction with last year. So it was a victory, I think.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. That's great. So Byron, how can HR and procurement leadership work together to create career paths that help employees see opportunity for advancement within the profession?
Yeah, I think for HR is going to be the one in the organization that's going to have the structure of the classification, the pay plan, and the policies. And the procurement leadership are the ones that's going to know the operations and the complexities of the work. So, many of you probably already have systems, classification systems set up, but it's the continual conversation with HR and bringing the importance of the work, letting them know if you are having difficulty recruiting. Surely they already know that, but talking about ways to retain people. And I think when you're talking about creating a career path for someone, people are visual. So the more that you can do in the recruitment process, it could be a simple graphic to show the career progression. And then you want to take it even further than that, as George said, the goal is ultimately to keep these people in the state system. If we're growing our own people, then branch off. If procurement, you get into a spot where you feel you want to move on to something else, what other areas in the state can you fulfill a role in? Many people probably already have what's called like a training series. We have what we call career progression groups here. And I think this is one of the most beneficial things, is that you develop a classification system where you may be a procurement specialist 1, and then it goes to a 2, 3, and a 4. And then a supervisor, manager, director, and so forth. For the leadership within procurement, my advice would be to be prepared to talk to HR about those distinctions between those job levels. If you have a lot of distinctions, you may have 4 different levels rather than 5 different levels. But it shows the employee that, there is that career path. So what you want to do is, when you get that person in, if you have, work with HR, or you can do it within your own, unit within procurement, if you know the classification system, when you sit down with that employee, we talked about competencies earlier. These levels, you want to make sure that it's just not time and seat, that there are competencies that you have to achieve to go to the next level in the group. but sit down with them and say, okay, you're a one right now. Have those one-on-ones like George was saying, that this is what you need in order to get to a two, a three, or a four. And if you're interested in supervisory experience, do you have a leadership program, whether it's for procurement or a generic leadership program? Start preparing those people. You really have to guide them. You really have to show them, give them something tangible rather than just talking about it. What we're seeing right now in many jobs, and I think it would relate to procurement as well. Sometimes we get in a position where someone's a really good worker and we promote them to supervisor, and then we have just done the worst thing ever because they're not a people person, right? We have specific roles here in Louisiana where we will have a pay level on a job that may be the same as a supervisor, but they don't supervise. There's a specialist in some type of area. So working with HR to continually evaluate your classification system and your structure will help to, build career paths. But, my advice, number one, is physically show them, talk to them about that. It's once you get them in the door, don't take a sigh of relief that I have someone. No, you need to make sure that you are providing that continuous performance management with them. Another thing that you can do is to ensure that if you have the opportunity, I know everyone is busy, but if you have the opportunity to mentor or cross train so they can learn in different sections, some people, may be interested in just RFPs, but if they could go to another section, travel or, something else, the more they learn, you're going to get those people and you're going to provide them with a greater skill set that they can move up.
That's a great point. I think that I loved your analogy about becoming a supervisor. It's not for everyone. Not
No.
everyone wants to be the front of the house, right? Some
Mm-hmm.
folks do, some folks don't. So it's critical to understand folks' skill set, but also where their interest lies. And it's
Mm-hmm.
by having those conversations. So maybe they don't become a supervisor, but maybe they become, let's say, a buyer for or something. So the
Right,
pay
right.
is equivalent, but you're not supervising others.
Yeah.
We've all done it, but it's not for everyone, right?
Yeah, right. And I think one of the things supervisors make mistakes with, and we're human, that we believe that it's our responsibility to make sure people see growth and compensation. That's the economy is bad, gas prices are high. I got to help my people get more money. When really and truly I need to help my people grow. I need to help them succeed in their job, and the compensation will come with that. So.
Yeah, especially in years when you can't give an increase. So you have
Right,
to be
right.
able to say, hey, I'm helping you in other ways, not in
Right, right.
financial ways. So,
Mhm.
so George, let's discuss mentorship and leadership development for a moment. So what role do mentorship programs, training, and leadership development initiatives play in preparing the next generation of procurement leaders?
That's a great question, but I think you guys already answered part of it in our previous conversation. Honestly, the discussion about two career paths, and I love being visual, like Byron was saying, is your career path line as an individual contributor or a supervisory role? And then I think also leadership role, right? Identifying that. And I think that's where mentors can play a significant role in anybody's career path, helping kind of flesh that out, right? Where do your passions lie? And we see that with other career paths, maybe in IT, you're great at this specific IT subject here, but maybe not cut out to be the manager of the group, right? And that's okay. And it's important to compensate them equitably. And sometimes that individual contributor, that rate is equal to that manager role, right? And we see that in the healthcare field as well, if not reverse. Those specialized roles sometimes demand a higher premium, right? So recognizing that and understanding and make sure that your comp structure reflects that. But I think a well-done mentorship program will help flesh that out. A poorly done mentorship program can do the opposite, right? It's not one size fits all. And I think we need to be careful with that. we see some agencies develop their own for their own culture, and a lot of times it's done really well. It's not pulled off the shelf and kind of generic. It's tailored to their agency and what their needs are. We see that with, for example, the Department of Fire and Forestry at the state of Arizona has significant tasks during those hot, dry years, which is every year, and they've developed a mentorship program in lieu of having something off the shelf for a medium-sized agency. We also have some very small agencies. How do they engage in mentorship programs when you have 3 or 10 people or maybe 25? We've developed some training programs and maybe some computer-based training and webinars that seem to kind of bridge that gap. Other training that we like to offer, we have a group called Governmental Transformation Office, GTO, and they have shifted their focus not only to from lean principles, which is kind of our management system here at Arizona, but also to leadership development, right? And things that specifically help executives understand what the training needs of their workforces are, right? And anything from emotional intelligence to conflict resolution, those type of things are very important for any career path. But if we're talking about procurement leaders, I want to get back to I think leadership development initiatives. I think one thing that leaders can do is open the doors and let people, we call it Gimba, go to where the work is. Go and pull them into some of those meetings where leaders are making decisions, if they can. Sometimes it's not appropriate, but expose people to what's going on in different parts of the organization, why their decisions are so critical on the procurement side, and how that flows through the rest of the organization. So exposure really helps develop your team. I think they find value in that. They feel valued. They feel part of the organization. I think that's a great way to kind of flesh out as well, what path do they want to take? Because they may have an image in their head, but until they're exposed to it, they don't really know. And maybe it's better to dip the toe than dive right in before making those decisions.
So maybe we can call the mentorship program Dip the Toe. I like that, right?
Yeah.
That would be interesting. People would be
Yeah.
like, oh, what is that? I think that's a great idea that you're taking a holistic approach and saying we need to look upriver and downriver to know, right? Procurement's many times kind of in the middle. So it's important to know what's happening on both sides to understand where you fit. Yeah. So we have a quick question in our Q&A box, and it's for both of you. How can procurement teams better partner with HR, finance, and other departments to strengthen workforce development and organizational outcomes?
I think it's, again, having those conversations. All of those groups have leaders. So I think it's going to those leaders and pitching the idea, can we get together, whether it's quarterly, whether it's monthly, or, let's have, we have a internal meeting here that my chief operating officer has with all of her administrators, and it's just like, a day where they just update each other. So I would start there. I would get buy-in from my leaders and say, look, we're all focused on the same thing. We all want the state to succeed, or we all want our organization to succeed. So can we come together, share our issues? Because there are things that I want to do in HR that I know I can't afford, but I know that somebody, in procurement may be able to find me a route to do that. Somebody in finance, I think when I was having a conversation for this meeting with one of your teammates, it was like, I need a car. What do you really need this fancy, SUV, or do you just need a Corolla to get where you're going? So having those real conversations of what we need and what we can afford. And then, you apply that to your workforce. What type of workforce do we need? I think Additionally, identifying any gaps in skills across those groups and being honest about that and creating a space where it's okay to be open and honest and show that we have some risk or some vulnerabilities there, so we can strengthen our workforce. I think just open communication is where it starts.
But that's a great point. And I think that anyone in public service cares about the citizenry of their
Mhm.
state, city, county, whatever it might be, and that we're all trying to make wherever we live a better place, right?
Right. Mhm.
So we're not, sometimes we fight internally a little bit when we're poaching each other's employees, but anyhow. So Byron, let's look ahead for a moment. What workforce strategies should public agency prioritize now to ensure they have a strong, skilled procurement workforce 5 to 10 years from now?
Yeah. Well, I always say the one thing that you can do is hire people who want to take your job. You find those people who are eager, who are telling you that they want to be, a manager the next day. Now, you might have to, put some constraints on them and reel them back in, but truly it's finding those people who are, really eager to learn. I think we've talked about most of these things already, what I would recommend. And I think it's first look at your hiring practices and make sure that you're modernizing those. And when I say modernizing, start looking at competencies and skill space if you're not already doing that. You want to make sure that you're broadening your applicant pool. It's not that you're trying to increase one group over another, where you're trying to increase stars, those who are skilled through alternative routes over degree people. That's not the case. You just want to be able to give your hiring managers a great pool of applicants. Look at your MQs, your minimum qualifications. Are they really necessary? Sometimes we have a tendency to put preferences in there and a lot of strict, narrow MQs. So be careful with that. Don't tie yourself in. Certainly, as you move up, we understand that you're going to need some specificity there and some experience. You couple that with what George was just talking about, leadership programs. In Louisiana, we have a leadership program for our agencies have been asking for a number of years. We need something before someone becomes a supervisor, because we had a model where once you were a supervisor, you were required to take these trainings, right? But so now we have one that's open to everybody, and it gives them the opportunity to have a certificate to say, I did this on my own initiative when I'm applying for jobs, that I'm prepared or, somewhat prepared. I'm ahead of the game already. The continuous performance management, you want to have those conversations with people. And then you have to stay closely aligned with HR, because at the end of the day, all of the mission and making an impact and all that, yes, that goes a long way, but at the end of the day, people do have to support themselves. So you want to make sure that you're working with HR and that you are helping them understand what the market is demanding for people in the procurement field. One of the best things that you can do for HR is when you are hiring individuals, if they're turning you down because of a salary offer, so ask them, well, what salary would it take to get you? Those things are critical. We do market surveys to see what other states are paying, what private industry is paying. So I would say stay aligned with HR so you can know when there's market shifts in pay and qualifications. It's not about filling just for today. It's about preparing for the future. So, and again, I think all of the stuff we talked about as far as internships, apprenticeships, mentoring, and one that's really difficult to do because it takes a lot of time is knowledge transfer. Documenting that knowledge transfer. You want to make sure that you're not siloed. So when Julia leaves, that, everybody's like, well, I don't know how to do this RFP because she was the only one who knew this area. Again, spread that knowledge around.
Well, that's a great point because at some point we'll all leave our positions, right? And I love what you said about you want to hire folks that someday want your position.
Right.
Not today, but someday. That's great.
Yeah.
We have a few questions in the chat, but I think we pretty much answered those. So, George, any final thoughts?
Yeah, one final thought. So I was prepping a little bit for this meeting, and I looked back on my emails, and I noticed a conversation between me and a procurement manager who was offering to do some procurement 101 for my HR staff because we had no clue, right? Where to direct our agencies when they'd reach out to us and needed support, and also just the process and whatnot. And then a little thing called COVID happened, and we never got to it, right? So I dusted it off the email a little bit. Unfortunately, that procurement officer is no longer with us at the state, but it's such a great idea. You know, I have a staff of HR professionals who are dedicated to taking care of all their agencies, but we have to equip them with the right knowledge. And just I'm looking at a description of what he was going to offer, just basically understanding the function of the state procurement office, differentiate between public and private, just your basics, you know. And I think that will help my team better service the procurement office. And so I'm just grateful for the opportunity to talk about it because it put it back on top of my list, right? We get so busy with our own departments that sometimes we forget we have to service our customers and understand what they need, what they truly need. So thank you.
And, you know, that's a really good point, George. I think sometimes in procurement, we think that everyone knows exactly what we do. But just like I'm not an HR expert, I never was, I had the basic understanding. We need to remember that folks don't know everything about procurement and be willing to train them and give them kind of the 101.
Right. You know, just thinking back, you know, one last thing on the military, we used to talk about beans, bullets, and Band-Aids. And that all comes from supply and procurement, right? If we don't have that, we don't do anything. We can't wage, you know, what we need to wage. And that, you know, same thing, my history, previous work experience was in large manufacturing. We didn't do anything without procurement. We couldn't, right? So it's at the core of business, and it's important that we understand that.
Well, we love to serve. So beans, bullets, and Band-Aids. I will remember that.
Yep.
I get
Byron, and anything else before we go?
No, just kind of echo what George said. You know, my procurement, just here in my office, I have a staff of 105, and my procurement director just tells me all the time, if I just listen to her, that everything will be taken care of. But I do think it is as simple as that. And, you know, I think in leadership, we need to talk about the good work that all different career fields provide to us, because procurement at the end of the day, as George said, like we can't do anything without them, and they're often in the background. And so, you know, I have to be intentional about that to showcase what they do to the agency so everyone sees that. You know, I tell them all the time, your job is to keep me out of the ditch, to make sure that, you know, I'm not going to run afoul of anything. So ultimately, you know, build that trust with your HR or just your leadership in general. And I would just like to say to everybody who's participating on here that the work that you do is very important to your organizations, and thank you for what you do, because I know that a lot of times, like many jobs, it goes you're not recognized as much as you should be recognized. So I would like to thank you for the work that you do, and it is making an impact.
Well said. Thank you. So that concludes today's presentation. I want to thank our presenters, George and Byron, for the valuable information they've shared today and for working with all of us at NASPO to bring it to you. Thank you all for attending today's webinar. And remember, this webinar qualifies for 1 contact hour for your continuing education credits. To receive your certificate, please fill out the survey in your browser once you exit the webinar. This webinar has been recorded and will be available for viewing on the NASPO YouTube page in the coming days. Also, remember to check out NASPO's upcoming webinars and the Pulse podcast at naspo.org. Thanks again to our wonderful presenters, and thank you to our guests. Have a great day.